Why is it that we've been told for generations that chasing is noble, that running after someone is proof of devotion, that the louder you declare your feelings, the more genuine they must be? Why is it that we applaud men who exhaust themselves in pursuit, but we call those who walk away weak, cold, or cowardly? What if the truth is the opposite? What if chasing isn't noble at all? What if it's desperation dressed up as romance? And what if walking away, not out of spite, not as some trick, but with calm dignity, is one of the strongest moves a man can ever make? See, a man grounded in himself doesn't chase chaos. He doesn't beg for attention. He doesn't try to force someone to see his worth. He recognizes when his presence is no longer valued, and he leaves. No shouting, no drama, no ultimatums, just silence. That isn't apathy. That's clarity. That's self-respect forged through fire. Because a man who has done the inner work understands something most people never learn. His energy is currency, and he refuses to spend it where it is wasted. This isn't a strategy. It's not about playing games. It's a spiritual boundary. And the man who can walk away, not in anger, not to manipulate, but out of principle, is the man who commands respect, not only from others, but from himself. So the real question isn't, how do I make her stay? The real question is, why am I still chasing someone who would let me disappear? That's where everything begins. And if you have the courage to sit with that question, it might just change your life. Now think about this. Why is it that the harder you chase someone, the faster they run? Why is it that the more desperate you are to prove your worth, the more invisible you become? Let me ask you something even more disturbing. Why are so many men today willing to betray themselves for the mere hope of affection? Not love, not loyalty, not respect, just hope. Think about that. A man will give up his dignity, abandon his mission, twist his values, all for the hope of a message, the hope of a returned call, the hope of a glance that says, "You still matter." Do you realize how rotten that is? Do you realize how deeply broken that trade is? To give away your soul for the possibility, not the guarantee, the possibility of being noticed. You see, when a man starts to chase, he's not just running toward her. He's running away from himself, away from insecurity, away from loneliness, away from the gnawing emptiness that whispers maybe, just maybe, he hasn't built a life worth standing still in. So instead of facing himself, he runs into her. He runs after her, hoping that if he just clings hard enough, if he just proves himself long enough, she will answer the question he's too afraid to ask. Am I enough? But here's the hard truth. No woman alive can answer that question for you. And the second you ask her to, you've already lost. That's why chasing feels so humiliating, because it isn't just about her. It's about you, about your identity, about the way you see yourself. Chasing puts you in a subordinate frame. You're no longer a force. You're a follower. You've turned your self-worth into a paycheck that only she can cash. And that is a path straight to hell. I've seen it play out thousands of times. Men losing themselves, not because they're weak by nature, but because they chose weakness over strength in the name of survival. They chose to beg rather than build. They chose to grovel rather than grow. And then they wonder why they are ghosted, disrespected, and discarded. It's simple. A man who abandons himself invites others to abandon him. But contrast that with the man who doesn't chase, the man who disappears, not because he doesn't care, but because he knows the cost of betraying his values. This man has standards. He has direction. He has a spine. He refuses to beg for what he knows he brings immense value to. That isn't arrogance. That's clarity. That's respect. Do you understand? A man's job is not to outsource his self-worth to a woman. It's not her responsibility to heal his wounds or prove his adequacy. That's his job. And it starts by stopping. Stopping the chase. Stopping the frantic running. Stopping the desperate search for approval. And instead, standing still in the chaos of rejection, in the silence of uncertainty, and asking, am I enough without her approval? If the answer is no, you're not ready for anyone. And here's the irony. The man who doesn't chase is the man who gets chased. Why? Because his presence radiates value. His absence carries weight. His self-sufficiency is magnetic. A man who doesn't need someone to complete him becomes the man everyone wants to be around. Because neediness repels. Wholeness attracts. It's primal. It's instinctive. So stop chasing. Not as a manipulation, not as a tactic, but because you have better things to chase. Purpose, discipline, excellence. Become the kind of man who doesn't have to ask for love because he commands it through the way he lives. And if she leaves, let her. Because the man who can stand tall in the face of rejection is the man who will never be forgotten. But let me tell you something hard. Chasing isn't romantic. It's desperate. And desperation is repulsive. Why? Because it signals hollowness. It signals a lack of internal structure, a man with no roots, searching for a stake to lean on. You don't chase because you love her. You chase because you've abandoned yourself. And that's the tragedy. There's this lie, this modern fairy tale, that love proves itself through relentless pursuit. That if you keep knocking, she'll eventually let you in. But love without boundaries isn't noble. It's pathology. It's addiction masquerading as devotion. And men fall for this trap because they confuse performance with connection. They think love is something you earn by doing more, by bending further, by proving harder. But love is not begging for scraps. It's standing still with dignity. And yes, that takes more courage than chasing ever will. The man who knows his worth doesn't chase because he understands something crucial. You cannot inspire attraction through submission. You inspire it through sovereignty, through command of yourself. When you twist yourself into a shape you think she'll love, you stop being yourself. You stop being the man she was drawn to in the first place. And she leaves, not because you weren't enough, but because you stopped being you. Do you see the tragedy in that? Relationships built on chasing almost always collapse. Why? Because they were built on imbalance, on one person pursuing and the other withdrawing. That's not love. That's a power game, and it breeds resentment. She loses respect for your constant availability. You resent her for never appreciating it, and the relationship dies, slowly, painfully, inevitably. But here's the contrast. The man who doesn't chase, the man who stands firm, he creates space, not distance, but space. And in that space, real connection can emerge. Respect, curiosity, desire. Because he isn't forcing it. He's allowing it. And the only kind of connection worth having is the one that arises naturally, between two people who recognize each other's worth without begging for it. But what if I lose her? Good. If your absence doesn't matter, your presence never did. If her affection requires you to constantly perform, constantly prove, constantly please, then you never had her in the first place. So stop auditioning for the role of man in her life. Start embodying it in your own. The world is full of men who've burned themselves out trying to hold on to someone who never wanted a partner, only a fan. But you're not here to be liked. You're here to be respected. And you earn that not through pursuit, but through purpose. Through being the kind of man who can walk away from anyone and still remain whole. That terrifies most men, because it means facing what they've avoided: loneliness, dependency, fragile identity. But here's the reward. When you finally stop chasing, you stop bleeding. You stop betraying yourself. And in doing so, you start to become powerful. Not because you're manipulating anyone, but because you've stopped manipulating yourself. So here's the truth. If she pulls away, let her. If she tests your boundaries, hold them. If she leaves, watch her go. Because the man who can stand his ground without flinching is the man she will never forget. And this is the brutal pattern. So many men lose themselves the second they feel affection. They meet a woman. They feel alive. They see possibility. And instead of standing tall in that truth, they panic. They cling. They fold. They become what they think she wants, terrified of losing what they just found. And in doing so, they disappear. But here's the painful reality. The moment you abandon your principles to secure someone's presence, you've already lost them. That isn't love. That's self-erasure. A real man doesn't compromise his identity to earn affection. He sharpens it. He deepens it. He becomes more of himself, not less. But weak men, men without purpose, without structure, they collapse. They turn relationships into their inner identity. They hope love will patch the hole in their soul. But real love can only exist between two whole people, not when one is hollow and trying to merge into the other. What happens when you make a woman your meaning? You put her on a throne, and you call that romance. But it isn't. It's worship. And worship is not intimacy. Worship suffocates. No woman wants to be the sole source of a man's worth. That's not attraction. That's pressure. And it crushes her. You think saying yes to everything will make her love you. You think being endlessly available will secure her respect. It won't. She'll start to question your backbone. She'll sense the emptiness behind your agreeableness. And eventually, she'll feel something she can't explain. Disgust. Because she doesn't see a man anymore. She sees a reflection of herself. And that isn't strength. That's fear disguised as devotion. But contrast that with the man who has built something inside himself. A man rooted in discipline, in mission, in truth. When he enters a relationship, he isn't looking for rescue. He isn't outsourcing his stability. He's inviting someone into a reality already worth living in. And that is when a woman leans in. Not because he begged her to, not because he chased, but because he didn't need to. Some of you have never tasted that kind of power. You've spent your whole life trying to please, believing that's what good men do. And yes, kindness matters. Compassion matters. But not when they are masks for weakness. Not when they're disguises for your inability to say no. Because it's the no that defines you. It's the boundary that gives you an edge. Not to dominate, but to protect. To protect your values. To protect your mission. To protect your soul. A relationship that demands you betray yourself to survive isn't a relationship. It's a slow death. So stop asking, what does she want from me? Start asking, what does truth require of me? And live by that. Because the woman who is meant for you won't run from your fire. She'll respect it. And if she doesn't, let her walk. Because the man who refuses to dim his light for approval is the only man whoever finds real love. Why do so many men still believe that if they just sacrifice harder, love deeper, stay endlessly available, they will earn respect? It's tragic. It's a trap. And it's one of the most destructive lies men live by. Because respect is never earned by chasing. The more you chase it, the more invisible you become. Men today have been conditioned to be agreeable, to keep peace, to avoid conflict. They've been told that strength is toxic, that boundaries are cruel, that masculinity itself is dangerous. But here's the truth. Strength without purpose is dangerous, yes. But strength rooted in principle? That is essential. I'm talking about moral sovereignty, the quiet presence of a man who refuses to bend his soul to chaos. When you deny your instincts, when you reduce your voice just to keep her from leaving, you're no longer a man in a relationship. You're a hostage in one. And here's the kicker. She will resent you for it. Not because she's cruel, but because you've handed her the burden of leadership while you shrink into passivity. That isn't love. That's betrayal. There is a reason truly masculine men disappear when they are disrespected. Not out of spite, not as a trick, but because they know that staying where they are dishonored is a violation of their own integrity. He doesn't threaten to leave to gain leverage. He simply leaves. Because he understands his power lies in absence, and that absence speaks louder than words. It says, I will not be twisted into something I am not. I will not betray my values to secure your approval. That man is dangerous, not to women, but to dysfunction, to manipulation, to delusion. But what about the man who stays too long, stays too quiet, stays too agreeable? He decays. He resents. He explodes in the wrong ways, at the wrong times. Or worse, he just fades into numbness. And she feels it. She knows it. She stops seeing him as a man. She sees him as a shell, and the damage spreads. Sons watch. Daughters learn. Patterns repeat. So let me ask you something hard. When was the last time you walked away from something that dishonored you? Not in rage, not in noise, but in silence. When was the last time your absence roared louder than your presence ever could? Because masculine men don't chase. They lead. And when leading isn't welcome, they leave. Because you cannot build a kingdom in the presence of someone who only sees you as a servant. And maybe this is the final wake-up call. Love is not easy. Real love is not effortless. It's brutal. It demands discipline. It demands truth. And if you haven't built yourself into the kind of man who can carry that weight, your relationships will keep collapsing. Not because love is broken, but because you are. Immature people destroy love, not because they're evil, but because they can't carry it. They can't stay when it's hard. They can't fight when it's painful. They run. Or worse, they stay shallow. And that is why love dies, not with betrayal, but with small compromises. With self-betrayal after self-betrayal, until you don't recognize yourself in the mirror. So imagine this instead. You had the courage to be fully known. Not perfect, not flawless, but real. Imagine standing across from someone and saying, "This is who I am. This is where I bleed, and I will not betray myself to keep you comfortable." That's terrifying. But that is where real intimacy begins. Because intimacy doesn't come from safety. It comes from courage. And that requires discipline. The discipline to show up when it's hard. To speak when it's uncomfortable. To own your darkness instead of hiding it. When both people do that, what you build is sacred. A bond that doesn't collapse under pressure. a love that evolves. But if you can't do that, you're not in love. You're in a slow-motion self-destruction. So stop asking, how do I make her stay? Start asking, why am I still chasing someone who would let me disappear? Because that right there, that moment of clarity, is the doorway to everything you've been running from. And the man who finds the courage to stop chasing and stand still in himself becomes the kind of man who doesn't need to beg for love, because he has become love, because he has become whole. And that kind of man is unforgettable.